Shalom, Erev Tov, good evening and welcome to the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute. My name is Roy Vilozny and I'm a fellow at the Polonsky Academy for Advanced Studies and also the head of the research and discussion group, The Transformations of Mythic Ideas in Shia Islam, which operates within the framework of the Mediterranean Neighbors Unit at the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute. I would like to thank Professor Gabi Motzkin, director of the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute, for his continuous support of the group's two-year activity, as well as Shulamit Laron, director of public events, for her help in the realization of tonight's symposium. Unfortunately, the importance of acquaintance with the discourse prevalent within the circles of radical Islamic movements is gradually becoming self-evident. Whether throughout the Fertile Crescent, Africa, the Arabian Peninsula, or in the heart of Paris, its devastating consequences have long ceased to be of local concern only. The title of tonight's symposium, When God Holds the Crescent on Both Sides, accurately reflects the content of the two lectures we are about to hear from Dr. Benedetta Berti and Mr. Daniel Love. God, naturally, does not hold the crescent on either side. Rather, this title alludes to the human depiction of God as having a clear preference for one manifestation of Islam over others. Perceiving God, and in turn describing him in concepts familiar to human beings, is of course a common characteristic of religions in general, and not only of Islam. It is nevertheless puzzling that God's omnipotence and omniscience, two of God's undisputed attributes in Islamic thought, are bound to sectarian religio-political views that adapt themselves to the changing historical circumstances. The lectures tonight will set out to show how different and at times even contradictory narratives are attributed to the same divine source, thus compelling God, so to speak, to side with one particular group and to exclude other groups from the realm of faith, an act which evidently narrows God's proclaimed total freedom and universalism, and which very often has far-reaching implications, including the use of brutal, uncompromising violence. The Arabic term to describe this exclusion is takfir, to which both speakers will refer in their talks. Tonight's symposium will focus on two Islamic movements that, in their own view, represent two of today's most important manifestations of the historical schism between Sunni and Shia Islam. Although both sides agree that this historical split occurred during the first decades of Islam, that is, in the 7th century, I believe that all those present here tonight are familiar with its relevance and centrality in recent world events. Finally, I would like to thank Dr. Idolit Manovich, the program director of the Mediterranean Neighbors Unit, who encouraged me a few months ago to organize an event that will shed additional light on the relationship between Islamic medieval sources, my personal specialization, and the actual role they play in current active radical movements. I thank him both for identifying the value of this juxtaposition, as well as for forcing me out of my medieval niche and bringing this evening to fruition. So thank you. And before I present our first speaker, let me just mention that each speaker will have 25 to 30 minutes to present his talk. And it will be followed following the lectures, we will open the floor for questions and discussion. Our first speaker tonight is Dr. Berti, who is a fellow at the Institute for National Security Studies, a lecturer at Tel Aviv University, and a TED Fellow. Dr. Berti is the author of 3 books, including most recently Armed Political Organizations, From Conflict to Integration, published by Johns Hopkins University Press in 2013. Her studies have been published, among others, in Foreign Policy, Foreign Affairs, Studies in Conflict and Terrorism, Democratization, and Mediterranean Politics. She is a young Atlanticist Fellow, a Kohlberg Foundation's Munich Young Leader, and a member of the UN Alliance of Civilizations, Global Experts. In 2015, the Italian government awarded her the Order of the Star of Italy. Dr. Berti, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you for the kind introduction. And I'm definitely not going to focus so much on medieval sources. Let me tell you one, before I start on Hezbollah, a word of myself. I have spent about the past 10 years working on Hezbollah, but mostly I work on their political, social ideology. That work started at this point in 2005 in Lebanon, and most of my research on Hezbollah has been carried out in Lebanon with direct interviews with the different parts of the group. So I will try to bring that perspective into the lecture. But for today, we're talking about how does Hezbollah justify its involvement in the Syrian civil war. And to do that, I'm going to, in the relatively brief time allocated to me, I'm going to try to do a few things. Number one, just in case we're not all on the same page, I'm going to get you all on the same page of what are the bases of Hezbollah's socio-political religious ideology. And I'm going to focus, of course, on the religious influence. Starting from there, we're going to look at how does the involvement in Syria challenge that narrative. And then I'm going to, using the last couple of years of speeches by Secretary General Hezbollah Hassan Nasrallah, I'm going to talk about how through rhetoric is operating a discursive reframing to basically get beyond the fact that there is a big contradiction between the original ideology of resistance as is presented in Hezbollah constitutive values and its intervention in Syria. So that's kind of the plan. Now, to begin, I've been told that here we have people who know absolutely everything about the organization and some who might be brought up a little bit to speed. So I'm going to do something sort of in the middle, and very brief introduction about Hezbollah. I'm not going to even indulge myself on telling you who they are or where they come from, but I'm going to focus on their ideological framework and how it is the combination of a religious mobilization and political mobilization process. We all know that the official starting point for Hezbollah received history is 1982, when the group is created as an umbrella organization to channel different Islamist factions. The cause célèbre, or the proximate cause that gets Hezbollah together, is of course Israel's intervention in Lebanon in 1982. But if we want to understand Hezbollah's framework or reference, we have to go a few decades back, and I'm going to do this very quickly, and basically look at the creation of Hezbollah as the culmination of a process of political mobilization that really began in the Shia community in Lebanon in the 1950s and had a few manifestations. First, a socio-economically driven one, then a more community religious-oriented under Musa al-Sadr, and then finally, through Hezbollah, a community transnational religious project. So in a way, Hezbollah is the culmination of decades of process of political mobilization of the Lebanese Shia community. On top of that, so on top of that historical process, there is of course also a process of religious activation. And here Hezbollah is the product of that early century revivalist, later turn revolutionary Shia movement that will see its culmination, of course, in the Iranian Revolution, but in terms of intellectual origins, we have to go back to the 1960s in Iraq. So that's the milieu. That's the political, ideological milieu through which Hezbollah is created, and it is both a brainchild of local political mobilization from the Shia community, as well as transnational influence coming from Iran. So if we want to understand the ABC, the layers of Hezbollah's ideologies, clearly we start with the religious layer, with the religious core, which is grounded in its Shia identity, as well as in its taking over and reappropriating the values of the Islamic revolution. Of course, that it's very important in order to understand how the organization functions today, because of course, both being Shia as well as subscribing to the teachings of Khomeini defines membership in Hezbollah. Most importantly, the relationship between Hezbollah and Iran is very much influenced by strategic interests, but also by this ideological proximity. So there's no question that the core layer of Hezbollah's ideology is rooted in its own Shia identity. And for my own presentation, I'm going to focus on a couple of themes that I think are absolutely crucial to understand Hezbollah's worldview, as well as its branding to the outside world. And in the call for this event, there was a reference to the idea of sacred narrative. So to me, at the core of Hezbollah's religious sacred narrative, there is many put let me do the parentheses, many scholars would start with the idea of jihad and the idea of armed confrontation. To me, that's not the core of Hezbollah's religious identity. To me, the core of Hezbollah's religious identity is rooted in that very strong dichotomy that you have in traditional Shia theological sources between the oppressor and the oppressed, and Hezbollah sees himself as very much to the forefront of the oppressed field. That is really important because it does a few things. Back then in the early 80s, it was a strong connection to the historical experience of marginalization and discrimination that the Shia community had pretty much lived in Lebanon uninterruptedly since the 11th century. On top of that, it allowed also to have a transnational connection to this experience of marginalization and discrimination that the Shia communities in most parts of the Middle East lived for, again, over 10 centuries. On top of that, there is also a way through this narrative of oppression and oppressed to transcend the Shia dimension and to make a direct link between Hezbollah's resistance on behalf of Palestine and its Lebanese identity. Through this, Hezbollah is able to transcend its sectarian identity and claim a pan-Islamic layer. This is very, very important to its own popularity in Lebanon and clearly to its own legitimacy in the greater Middle East. So it all stems from this. The organization seeing themselves as to the forefront of this real historical war between the oppressor and the oppressed and transcendent religious narrative in which the Shia experience of oppression is again reminded and rooted in the group's discourse over and over. Very connected to the idea of oppressor and oppressed, you have, of course, the idea of self-sacrifice, which is very much to the very core of the DNA of the Shia religious identity. So it's not a mystery that, and I've, at a certain point in my work, I have actually counted it, there is virtually has been not a speech that Nasrallah has given since he has been a secretary, so since the early 90s, in which he hasn't mentioned Karbala at least once in the speech. So that's very much a visual imagery, a symbolic imagery, and a way to bring together the idea of oppression at the same time the idea of self-sacrifice. That's to the core of Hezbollah's discourse. It's Hezbollah's discourse 101, back in the 90s as well as today's. But of course, to justify it in Syria, I'll take you through how they do that, because it's not necessarily a straight line. So the sacred narrative is about oppression, is about self-sacrifice, it's about the idea of Karbala, and the idea of jihad is rooted in all this, but it's more a consequence rather than a foundation. In other words, the foundation is this seeing themselves as the vanguard of this Islamic resistance, and jihad becomes one of the main tools employed. So basically you have this idea of the core religious identity, which we all know, and it's very much grounded in Shia Islam. However, I argue that if we want to understand Hezbollah's political development, we have to get beyond that core layer, because that core layer is self-limiting, and self-limitation doesn't work well for an organization that has very strong political interest. So on top of this very core particularist, sectarian, if you wish, identity, and I'll get later to the fact that Hezbollah will never agree on being qualified as sectarian, but that's later. So on top of this core Shia identity, there is a pan-Islamic identity. The pan-Islamic identity that is carried out through this idea of standing, again, for the Palestinian cause, and through this advancing the cause of the Ummah, regardless of sectarian affiliation, and Lebanon as well, which gets me to the third layer, that yes, Hezbollah is Shia, yes, Hezbollah has pan-Islamic aspirations, and thirdly, Hezbollah, since the end of the Lebanese civil war, describes itself, and I'm talking about the narrative, because that's what the lecture is about, describes itself as firmly Arab, firmly Lebanese, and firmly grounded in its Lebanese reality. In a way, of course, there is a contradiction between the transnational links with Iran, the pan-Islamic orientation, and the nationalist rhetoric. This is not lost on Hezbollah. And the only way I think that the organization keeps all these different hats together in a cohesive way is through its main narrative, which is the narrative of resistance. And only through the narrative of resistance can Hezbollah reconcile these different identities. The narrative of resistance, the Muqawama, is extremely important to understand how Hezbollah sees itself in Lebanon, in the region, and in the world. It's important because the ideal of resistance allows to create a non-contradiction between identities that are inherently contradictory by definition, such as pan-Islamic and nationalist, for example. And it does that through, first of all, reiterated importance of standing up against oppression, which is the step one. So Hezbollah sees itself as part of this resistance project, which is also defined as an countercultural opposition project. The cause célèbre, the raison d'être, becomes resisting the notion of occupation, and that at the beginning is territorial occupation in Lebanon, but very early on, by the mid-80s, has been extended to the cause of Palestine, which becomes the way to tie together all these identities. Because by fighting for Palestine, Hezbollah can say and can argue convincingly to its audience that it's representing Shia community interests in Lebanon, given the relationship between Shia communities historically in Israel. By standing up for Palestine, Hezbollah can say that it's embodying a pan-Islamic ideal, because of course, fighting for Palestine is about fighting for the entire Ummah. It's not a sectarian cause, and that's why the image of Jerusalem is so strong in Hezbollah's own rhetoric, and Al-Aqsa Day is one of the most important celebrations that the organization has every year, and when some of the most important speeches come out in terms of strategy. Finally, Palestine also allows to ground Hezbollah in a nationalist identity, because because through the fight in Israel, Hezbollah also claims the role of the national resistance. So the narrative of resistance to me is absolutely the glue that keeps all these seemingly disconnected identities together. And it also does something even more important, in my opinion, which is it allows Hezbollah's reappropriation and recreation of a new history for the Shia community in Lebanon. And it does so, again, through the theme of resistance. And it goes like this. Up until the beginning of Hezbollah, the experience is one of discrimination, marginalization, second-class citizenship. The redemption, the empowerment comes through shifting from a society of victimhood to one of combatants, one of resistance. So resistance is redeeming historically and on a transcendental level, and that's extremely important. And it's not just a military project, it is the resistance of the Ummah, of every single citizen, and it's the resistance of the Mujahideen, so the fighter. And Hezbollah's Deputy Secretary General Naim Qasim says it all the time, that it's about this resistant project of creating a combatant society. And it's not just the idea of resistance al-Muqawama, but it's al-Muqawama al-Shamila, so entire, holistic. And he will add al-Madaniya, so civil. So it's absolutely not just a military project. And it's basically grounded on two values, and I want to mention them because then I'll get to Syria and tell you how these values really are difficult to apply to the involvement in Syria. One is liberation, Tahir, this idea of liberation struggle. And again, liberation for the Shia community against this historical role of marginalization, liberation for Lebanon from foreign occupation, and liberation for the Ummah through the fight on Palestine. The second element, together with liberation, is refusal, disobedience. And again, it goes back to this dichotomy, oppressor and oppressed. There's no way around it. It is the glue of the resistance project. And this whole idea is the creation of this new citizenship, putting the Shia community from a place of marginality to one of centrality in the Lebanese national project by making them the guarantor of the resistance. And it becomes about self-sacrifice and solidarity. That becomes the most important values as seen by Hezbollah for its own community. And this glorification of the idea of the martyr that becomes a man of glory, a man of sacrifice, and it is glorified in his sacrifice today as if it was Hussein in Karbala. And that's the recurring theme. It's a very simple one, but that's pretty much omnipresent in the rhetoric of Hezbollah, even through its involvement in the Syrian civil war. Although, as I will say, it works less well when applied to Syria. So you have the narrative of resistance as this national glue, as this pan-Islamic glue, and this Shia glue. You have this creation of this project of resistance, which basically allows the organization to do politics, to do social work, and to do military struggle at the same time, and it's all cohesive. And then there is the idea of Hezbollah's own perception of where it stands in Lebanon, and where its community stands in Lebanon, because Hezbollah sees itself as the key representative of that community. And there's the idea of Hezbollah's tripartite formula, which is the people, the resistance, and the army. And it's very important because basically means that from the Shias being completely absent to the national historiography of Lebanon, through Hezbollah they become one of the three key holders by representing the national resistance project. So again, this is really important in terms of understanding how Hezbollah brands itself, but also the tight relationship it can have with its own community, because there's a lot of political value to this reframing, I would argue. Now, all this is all right and it's all good and well, and it holds, especially holds after 2006. I was at the time, that's when my first time in Lebanon was spent, and it was definitely a time when the idea of resistance as a national project, even though behind closed doors was highly criticized by Hezbollah's opponent, at least in public, it was still thought as highly unwise to dare to speak against it. Now, fast forward to 2015, and fast forward to a few years of direct involvement in the Syrian civil war. And I argue that there's a little bit of problems between this narrative and the actual involvement. There's three main problems by Hezbollah being heavily involved in Syria that contradict this narrative of resistance. The first one is national resistance or sectarian militia. And if there is a word that is heavily, heavily loaded in a pejorative way for Hezbollah, is sectarianism. When Hezbollah refers to its enemies being champions of Taifiyya, what Nasrallah means is that they are engaging in the lowest kind of politics. Hezbollah's key political project in Lebanon has been abolishing sectarianism since they started to compete in elections in 1992. So for them, being branded as a sectarian militia sends them all the way back to where they started back in 1982. So it's absolutely a key threat to the image, to the narrative. The second problem is another thing that they spent decades doing is trying to shed this image of them being an Iranian proxy or an Iranian puppet. And again, when they became a political party, they went out of their way to constantly say, we're not Iranian, we're Lebanese. Fast forward to 2011 when the Syrian war starts, and you start having Hezbollah's political opponents say, well, you're becoming sectarian because you're fighting on behalf of a sectarian cause by backing Assad, and you become Iranian because you're supporting the Iranian by being in Syria. You've lost your two key national components. And thirdly, how can you talk resistance is a project that you wage on behalf of the oppressed for the Islamic Ummah by emphasizing self-sacrifice, selflessness, and glory. Now, how can you apply the word resistance when you're fighting against Assad, who is the ruler, the incumbent, so the most powerful, who is bent on cracking down on other Muslims, who is himself really Alawites are part of our Shia just because there was some political bargaining there. Let's say it wasn't a very theologically deep integration. So there's a lot of points that can be made to say that this is not a resistance project, it's a sectarian one, and it's an Iranian one. So if that's the case, I want to just do a little parenthesis. And the parenthesis is, if all of this is true, and I think it is, that these are and it is true that this is what Hezbollah's opponents have said about Hezbollah, then why bother? Why even go there? If it's such a big challenge to everything the organization has built in the past 2 decades. And here is it's a non-narrative strategic parenthesis that I think helps us anyways, and that is the investment in Syria is not an ideological one, I would say. I stand by it. I actually am very happy to engage in a conversation about it, but I stand on my assertion. It is a strategic one, and it has to do with domestic politics, regional politics, and geopolitics. And if we try to justify it if we try to look at it through the religious ideology lens, it's limiting. Because I argue that Hezbollah is in Syria for really a couple of really simple main reasons. First of all, if there is one actor that has kept Hezbollah's weapons for decades, that has made sure that Hezbollah's weapons would not be even questioned in Lebanon, is definitely Syria. And after 2005, so after the Syrian withdrawal, Syrian influence in internal political affairs has continued to be prominent and has continued to be a key force multiplier for Hezbollah. So this is a strategic partnership. It's a strategic partnership, it's an historical one, and then there's very strong personal ties between Bashar al-Assad, who in a way has had a mentor relationship with Nasrallah after his father, Hafez al-Assad, died. So there is an historical, a personal, and a political dimension to that relationship. As such, for Hezbollah, seeing Assad fall is simply non-negotiable. So that means that if it's necessary to reframe ideology to justify the involvement in Syria, so be it. It's more important because at the end of the day, Assad in power means status quo in Lebanon, means that there is no second wind to the independence, intifada, Cedar revolution, however you want to call it. And it means that that strategic link between Iran and Hezbollah is preserved. So this is a geostrategic interest, is a political one. And on top of this, in the last 2 years, there is a, I would say, reasonable worry from Hezbollah's ranks about the rise of Salafi jihadist factions in Lebanon, and from the fact that some of these groups are on the Lebanese-Syrian border very much attacking Hezbollah. And I'll get to the suicide attacks in a couple of minutes. So there are very strong interests as to why Hezbollah would cross the Rubicon and do something that he had said historically will never do, namely turn weapons against other Muslims, which he had done anyways in 2008, but that's a different story. So how does he explain, how does an organization that has this very strong and very, I would say, powerful resistance, how does it justify it? And yeah, I have how much? Oh, perfect. 10 more minutes is exactly what I need to tell you how Hezbollah gets out of this pickle, basically. And very early on, the way it does, it embraces the Arab awakening full on. If you go through Nasrallah's first speeches, it's very clear that Hezbollah sees itself as strongly linked, a link of solidarity with the revolutions in Tunisia, in Egypt. When Mubarak falls, Nasrallah says, these are the revolution of the poor, of the free, of the freedom seeker. Again, the link with the oppressed, key. And then he says, these are the revolution of those who are rejecting the humiliation, oppressor, of the United States and Israel. So he immediately makes the link between the Arab awakening and the countercultural movement they represent, and the Arab awakening and the resistance. That link may be fictitious, but it doesn't matter. The rhetoric is what we're analyzing, and the rhetoric was there from day one. So when Syria begins, and all this becomes quite difficult to justify in light of standing up with Assad, Hezbollah does a few things. First of all, he says, being in Syria does not mean betraying the resistance. Being in Syria means honoring the resistance. I'm quoting Nasrallah. Why? One, because he says, Bashar al-Assad, unlike Mubarak, unlike Ben Ali, is not an unpopular ruler. There is division, and we don't, and be Nasrallah here, and we don't oppose reforms, but there is a fundamental difference, and that is the Syrians are standing steadfast with Assad. He also says there is one reason why Bashar al-Assad is having such a hard time in Syria, and that reason is because there's external interest, infinitely more powerful, coming from the United States and Israel, that have an interest in getting rid of Bashar al-Assad. Why? Because Syria has been, throughout the decades, the key link of the resistance project. So in Nasrallah's word, Syria is at the forefront of the resistance project, and he says, this is in his first big speech in the spring of 2013 when he acknowledges that Hezbollah is in Syria, and he says, if Syria falls, Palestine will be next. So for us, being in Syria is not forgetting about our main raison d'etre, which is Israel, which Nasrallah wouldn't call Israel, but that's a different story, are being in Syria is because we acknowledge that the political link between Syria and the Palestinian resistance is so strong that if Bashar al-Assad falls, the axis of resistance will be destroyed. Now, again, I'm talking about the rhetoric, not the reality. And this is the message, and it's been very consistent from the first speech in which they publicly said we're in Syria, so from the spring of 2013 to the last speech I listened to a couple of days ago. This is the key motivation as to this. We're not betraying the resistance, we're standing up for the resistance. This is a political argument, however, not a religious one. The second argument they make is political with a tinge of religion, but in a way that it's surprising, because the second main argument is we are in Syria because we're not sectarian, which gives us a little bit of a reason to pause, because from the outside it's very easy to make the link, of course. But Hezbollah justifies it in a very interesting way. They say, Nasrallah says, nobody can accuse us of sectarianism. One, because if Syria falls, there will be a division in the resistance axis that will benefit only Israel and the United States, who are behind this anyways, behind all this project of seeding discord. Again, remember, I'm channeling Nasrallah here. The second main theme that is related is we're not sectarian because we're in Syria, and this has started in 2014. We are not in Syria because we're there to fight the Takfiris. And how does Nasrallah say? In the last Ashura, well, not in this Ashura, in Ashura 2014 speech, he made a very strong emphasis on this theme, and it was very interesting because he said, those who call this a Sunni-Shia clash have misunderstood. ISIS, which is al-Nusra, says Nasrallah, they're the same, they're just fighting over organizational power, and on this one I think he might be right. But point is, he says, when al-Nusra is fighting, or ISIS are fighting either Syrian rebels, this is Sunni versus Sunnis. When ISIS is murdering people in Kobane, this is Kurds, who are Sunni, last time I checked, says Nasrallah. When Christians are attacked, this is not a sectarian warfare. When the Yazidi are massacred, this is against religious minority. In other words, he says, this has nothing to do with Sunni Shia. That I'll tell you what he tells to his own community. But this is the public speech through Al-Manar, to the people of Lebanon. This has nothing to do with Sunni Shia. This has all to do with the fact that this new brand of extremism is perverting Islam. And by perverting Islam, they're becoming a challenge to the Sunnah and to the Shia in equal manner. And he also says that it is a partition scheme that comes from the outside to want to create this Sunni versus Shia. This is interesting because for Nasrallah, this has been one of the key messages. The Takfiris are a threat to Lebanon, and that's why Nasrallah started calling on the Lebanese armed forces to cooperate with them, as they do, to defeat ISIS on the border town, Arsal, etc. So it's very important for Hezbollah to publish this, to brand this as a non-sectarian struggle. So when we take these two elements together, fighting in Syria for the resistance and fighting in Syria against the Takfiris, I get to what I think today Hezbollah is doing, which is a new call for a new Mukawama project. And the new Mukawama project is very interesting because it's a reframing of what resistance is. And today, Nasrallah says that there are two types of resistance, which is something that Hezbollah never said before. There is the resistance, which is the project against Israel, but there's a new resistance, which is the one to defend Islam. And he said very clearly in January 2015 that he had said many other times that the Takfiris are perverting Islam. But in January 2015, for the first time, he says the Takfiris are not just offending Islam, but they're putting Islam under threat. As such, there is a duty to step up to protect Islam because Islam is under attack. So basically saying there is a duty to wage a defensive jihad, not just Shias, but also Sunnah, against the Takfiri threat. So again, the ISIS brand of Salafism, which Nasrallah calls the Takfiri threat. And that's quite new. That's a quite new reframing of what resistance is. So today for Nasrallah, Mukawama is against Israel. That doesn't change. And for Palestine, and it is about the Takfiri threat. And together, he is calling for this new tripartite formula. Again, the people, the resistance, and the army, but this time fighting ISIS as much as fighting Israel, which is Again, an interesting reframing of reality. How does sectarianism, and I'll close with that, how does sectarianism play into all this? It does and it doesn't. Meaning, in all the national speeches, it doesn't. If there's something that Nasrallah's be consistent, is by denying they are sectarian. At all. At the same time, reality is in his face, kind of showing a little bit of a different understanding, at least to some extent, of why Hezbollah is in Syria, I would say. And I'm being generous here. But again, this is something that Hezbollah doesn't accept. For example, one of the first major public involvement that Hezbollah takes is to defend the Sayyidah Zainab shrine, right? So we are in Western Ghouta, and Nasrallah says, our first real involvement, and this is March 2014, our first time we got involved militarily in Syria is to defend the Sayyidah Zainab shrines. But it's not because we are sectarian. It's because this is a shrine that all Muslims value, which of course we know to be a little bit of an exaggeration of reality. And secondly, they say because if the Takfiris would have destroyed the shrines, they would have started a holy sectarian war between Muslim and Shia. So we stepped in to stop that war. Interesting. Again, we're talking about the power of narrative, and that is the narrative. Parenthesis. When the speeches are not given on national television and they're not national, so in local speeches from local commanders, then you hear a lot more about the value of the shrines, you hear a lot more about defending the Shia communities, and you hear a lot more about a language. If nothing will be said about being sectarian, but the kind of language and themes are far more in line with sectarianism. But the official rhetoric is very clear on this, but this is the real contradiction, of course, because on the one hand, Hezbollah brands itself with its Syrian involvement as non-sectarian. De facto, the Syrian war has become very much connected to sectarian dynamics, and de facto, because of Hezbollah's involvement in Syria today, the Shia community has become a target for Takfiri groups. And of course, we had the Beirut bombing only a few days ago. That was the largest, and it happened in the Dahia, but there's been a string in the past 2 years. So despite the rhetoric about the lack of sectarianism, de facto now Shia community will be in a position in which some say, well, because Hezbollah is putting them on the front line, they should start criticizing Hezbollah. I argue exactly the opposite. Because they're on the front line, they have no option but back Hezbollah even more, because there's no one else that can defend their own community. Finally, the language of martyrdom, it's there, but Hezbollah on practice say we need to honor these new martyrs from Syria as if they were in the resistance against Israel. That's the message. In practice, because Hezbollah is not very keen on showing how many coffins are coming back from Syria, the martyrs are not being honored in the same way, and that's actually one of the elements that's driving an internal protest movement about the fact that they have to be awarded the same status, whereas Hezbollah wants very much to downplay their funerals, not for religious reasons, again, for strategic ones. So I'm looking forward to hear the other side of the crescent, so to speak, and I think I'll end here, and we can talk later about what this all means outside the narrative. Thank you.